Hello, it's Scott Manley here. It's June 28th. It's time for another batch of deep space updates, and boy, do we have some massive news in this episode. But we're going to start with the launches, starting on June 15th when China launched a Long March 2D, and it carried 41 satellites on it, and this is a record for China. Now, most of these satellites were called Jilin 1 Gaofen. There were actually three different varieties of these, and these are basically Earth observation satellites. The company that launches them does commercial Earth imaging. They sell the content onwards. They've actually been launching satellites for a long time. I think like some of their satellites can resolve to as low as like half a meter resolution. Previously, they've been launching these satellites on, well, basically every rocket, I think, in the Chinese fleet. Okay, so 18th of June, there was a Falcon 9 carrying Satria, which is an Indonesian geostationary orbit comm satellite built by Thales Alenia. 20th of June, there was a Long March 6 carrying Xi'an 25 into sun synchronous orbit. Now, it's probably an imaging satellite, but we never know with these secret launches. Long March 6, by the way, is the sort of light version of the cryogenic Long March series. It's smaller than the 5 and smaller than the Long March 7. On the 22nd of June, there was a Falcon 9 launch from Vandenberg carrying 47 Starlink satellites in Group 5-7. This was in the middle of the night. I stayed up past midnight to watch this and try to take a photo, and the clouds just did not cooperate with me. But I'll take it. This launch was notable because it went from Vandenberg into an orbit that was like 43-degree inclination, which I think is the lowest that's ever been achieved from Vandenberg. And so this required going down along the coast, landing like off of Baja, California, while the second stage makes a 10-degree dogleg to bring the inclination down low enough. Very impressive stuff there, very impressive capabilities. Soon after, there was a Delta IV Heavy, one of the penultimate Delta IV Heavy from the East Coast, NROL 68, also known as USA 345. This was a super secret launch into geostationary Earth orbit, and since the Delta IV Heavy is one of the biggest things capable of throwing stuff into geostationary orbit, this is almost certainly another Orion signals intelligence satellite. We've heard about these things. I did a video about it in the past. It's not clear just how big this is, but some people believe that it folds out to be like 100 meters across, which is just stunningly big. But yeah, super secret spy stuff going on. 23rd of June, there was another Falcon 9 carrying 56 Starlink satellites from Florida. This is another batch into Group 5. It was 5-12. So that meant they were also going into a 43-degree orbit, but they took a much easier way to get there. There was 46 from Florida versus 47 from Vandenberg, where they have to make that dogleg. But it obviously helps in terms of cadence if you're able to use all your launch sites. And on 27th of June, Russia launched a Soyuz from Vostochny with a Fregat second stage. It was carrying a meteor weather satellite, but also GK Launch Services, who was running the mission, it was a ride share with like 30 other small satellites, mostly for educational institutes around Russia, Belarus, but there was also partners from Malaysia and the UAE, and I'd love to say more about the science and the studies that they're actually doing. These small satellites are from universities. They're doing things like space weather, astronomy, X-ray astronomy, Earth observation, and of course communication testbeds. Also in the last couple of weeks, there have been a couple of really important suborbital launches. So on the 18th of June, Rocket Lab made their first launch of their HASTE platform. That's where they take an electron and they just allow more payload on it so that they can drop the vehicle back into the atmosphere and perform re-entry hypersonic testing of payloads. And so this mission was called Scout's Arrow. At the time, there was not a broadcast, but somebody did turn up to actually stream it from the ground. And we found out later that it was the Dynamo A payload, which is a technology demonstrator for Dynetics. Don't know anything else about it. Also, a couple of weeks later, or a week or so later, France carried out a flight test of their VMAX hypersonic glider. They launched out of a launch site on the west coast of France over the Bay of Biscay. And yeah, it was visible from both France and from Spain, and yeah, military launch. So we don't really know that much about it. Now, we had expected to have the final launch of the Ariane 5. However, they found technical problems in the testing of pyrotechnic lines, which are kind of important for stage separation. So they scrubbed the launch and have rolled it back so that they can actually replace these and verify, to the best of their ability. Because pyrotechnics, they work once. You can't test them. You just have to make sure that you're very, very sure that they're going to work. So currently, the launch is scheduled for July 4th. But anyway, the biggest news, I think, for me as a science type person, is in the last few hours we've heard that the NanoGrav collaboration has found the long sought hum of gravitational waves from giant black holes all around the universe. So gravitational wave astronomy, we obviously have LIGO that has been able to find these chirps, right? There are events where two black holes spinning around each other spiral down into each other very quickly, and they form these like frequency chirps. As they get closer and closer, the frequency rises and then they disappear. And that is sort of their final merger moment. And these are happening commonly enough that we've observed something like 100 of these events. But these are small black holes. These are black holes of a few stellar masses, maybe tens of stellar masses. We know that there are supermassive black holes, things with hundreds of thousands, millions, maybe even billions of solar masses in the hearts of some galaxies. And if you do the math, then you see that these things are much, much more powerful. But because the black holes are big, the orbits take longer. And these should be emitting gravitational waves at a much lower frequency. And we're talking frequencies of nanohertz, frequencies where things can take months, days, years perhaps to oscillate. So there has been a project for the last 15 years to accurately measure the timing of pulses from pulsars nearby. They're looking mainly at pulsars within 20,000 light years or so. And they measure these versus atomic clocks. They look every couple of weeks at these objects and see if the pulses have shifted a little. And they have observed shifting. And moreover, they've observed that the shifting of the frequencies between various pulsars is correlated in a manner that suggests that the distance between them is being dilated by low-frequency gravity waves. So we're talking about shifts in distances of like 1 meter per light year. So they've been doing this for 15 years and publishing null results, and now they think they have evidence in the amount of data they've collected. Now they're reporting a detection at a 3.5 to 4 sigma level. So that's like a better than 99% confidence that this is a real signal and not something that's just risen out of massaging the data. But there's a small chance that it isn't, and they are going to continue looking at it. But this is important because it shows that gravitational waves can now be found at much, much lower frequencies. And now you can do this. It means you can study an entirely new type of gravitational universe, and you can start to think about perhaps cataloging and discovering supermassive black holes that aren't necessarily active, but are certainly emitting huge amounts of gravitational waves, as opposed to jetting out, matter and creating active galactic nuclei. This is a big deal. It's another step forward that will transform the way we look at the universe. And that's why I'm excited by it. The other big news of the last week is only tangentially related to spaceflight because, yes, we all know by now about the Titan submarine that was down visiting the Titanic. And its primary link to spaceflight is the fact that, well, it is a bit like a spacecraft in that it's carbon fiber and has life support, but it did have a passenger called Hamish Harding who had flown on New Shepard to space. He had also visited the Challenger Deep on the limiting factor submersible, but this time he was going to see Titanic in the Titan, and he is not coming back along with the 4 other passengers. Well, one was actually not a passenger. He was the CEO of OceanGate. Now, I've talked about this last week in great detail while not being entirely sober. Today we saw debris getting brought back to the shore and getting offloaded. We saw the hemispherical end caps and the equipment in the tail module actually not being completely crushed. So it's very clear that this is not a failure of the titanium caps. It's something to do with the carbon fiber pressure vessel. And, it is interesting that there was this talk about the CEO saying, oh, you don't do titanium and carbon fiber. Well, it turns out that we uncovered this paper from 1988 where the US Navy was working with a drone called the Advanced Unmanned Search System that went even deeper and used a carbon fiber pressure vessel with titanium end caps, and they went to even deeper depths. Now, they went into great detail about the exact construction of this, but actually, if you look at the size of this thing, it's a scaled version in terms of its wall thickness. So, at this point, they've pulled the stuff back to shore. There is almost certainly little bits of human remains that have been squished in there, but not anything that's recognizable, and it is sad. But yeah, it's not really spaceflight. But I was definitely interested in all sorts of levels, just like I am super interested in the fact that we had a presidential visit in my backyard and I saw, Marine One flying over getting escorted by Ospreys, and some local pilot in a Mooney decided to take off without checking the NOTAMs and was intercepted by jets because he just decided to fly south. Yeah. I mean, that's all sort of not interesting for you, but sort of relevant is the fact that the FAA have announced new airspace closure plans for launches from Florida that will actually allow more aircraft to get closer because the rockets have now proven themselves to have more control, and therefore they can shrink down the no-fly zones around it, or the temporary flight restrictions around them. There was actually like Aviation Safety magazine, I think a recent issue was entirely devoted to the interaction of the FAA's like National Airspace System and space launches. But anyway, you guys aren't interested in that either. You are probably interested in Starship. And yes, Starship, there was some big talk in the last couple of weeks. So there was a Space's Space, Ashley Vance and Elon Musk talking about Starship. And the big thing that came out of this is that this next launch of Starship is going to use hot staging. That is, instead of doing this ridiculous thing where it rotates fast and lets go and then this thing flies away and then it lights its engine, they are just going to light the engines on the second stage while the first stage engines are still firing. They're going to use the 3 center Raptors firing at 50% thrust. And now we had actually seen some hardware around that could fit the bill of like exhaust vents. These are rings with laser cut bars, so they're structurally strong, but they also have room for gases to exhaust. Presumably this will also require some sort of shield over the top of the booster tanks. But they claim that this will get them about 10% extra in terms of payload. And I'm not 100% convinced on that, and truthfully there's a lot of other variables that are flying around as they redesign all these things. So they might get 10% overall, but definitely it's going to improve their performance. If you think about it, they are adding extra mass to the rocket, but it is all extra mass that is on the first stage. And typically, if you add 7 tons to the first stage, then you lose 1 ton on the second stage, right? That's roughly how it works. So you can add a lot more mass to the first stage and not lose nearly as much mass on the second stage. Get how that works? But a lot of it is probably losses in that flip maneuver that they planned. Now, I'm not clear at this point how the engines on the first stage will operate, because by the time they're getting to stage separation, they'll have burned through most of their propellant. They will have probably shut down a bunch of their engines. But this thing will presumably have to produce thrust at much, much lower levels. So they might have, I don't know, they might have just one engine running at one point to provide ullage and to provide thrust vector control so they can begin their flip back. But presumably, it sounds like they're keeping all the engines running. They can't keep all the engines running because the top one the Starship has to be able to separate. Also at Starbase, they had a massive concrete pour They had been building out rebar underneath the pad in the giant hole. And I don't know how many concrete trucks came in, but there was an awful lot. And while we might think that it would take perhaps months for it to fully cure, it looks like they're just going straight to work on top of this thing. Also, the Starship test article, Starship number 25, it finally got a full spin prime test and then a full 6-engine static fire test. So that is operational. I'm guessing they'll start going over to booster testing whenever the launch pad is ready. They keep saying 6 weeks till the next launch, and it will probably be 6 weeks until the next launch until it becomes 5 weeks until the next launch, and so on and so forth. Over at ULA, they have confirmed that they know that the problem with the second stage that caused the failure back in March, their solution is going to add some reinforcement to the top of the tank so that they don't fail under these conditions and they don't get a leak that produces hydrogen and destroys their test stand. That means that they are calling off the July launch at this point. They're taking the Centaur off the top of the Vulcan that they did their test fire with. That's going to go on the rocket ship all the way back to Decatur. They'll take a test article off the production line, which I saw, and they'll ship that over to Marshall, which is really close by, perform their qualification tests, and presumably while they're doing the qualification test, they will be reinforcing one of their vehicles for their flight. And I won't be surprised if it's the same flight article that was used, because they've already done a lot of qualification on it, but it might be just as reasonable for them to set up another one. Either way, it's looking like it'll be Q4 before they are actually able to fly Vulcan, which is unfortunate, and this means that it really won't be operational until 2024, assuming everything works. But yeah, I'm hoping their customers will continue to hold on. It's not clear, like, if they're gonna need to move any national security launches off of Vulcan and onto SpaceX. I'm sure SpaceX is ready. You might equally find that payloads get swapped back and forth for timing reasons, but the number of launches actually ultimately remain the same. At Stennis, NASA and Aerojet Rocketdyne performed the 12th and final certification test for the RS-25E engine. That is the next version of the RS-25 engine that will be used on Artemis 5 and beyond. These are the new engines that are being built rather than the old engines which were used on space shuttle missions. Anyway, in deep space, Bepi Colombo flew by Mercury, and they published nice images from this flyby highlighting a bunch of craters on the surface of Mercury. And everyone noticed that there was a new crater there called Manley. Yes, Manley Crater on Mercury. Named after Edna Manley, a famous artist and sculptor in Jamaica. Also, I believe, was it the mother of Michael Manley? But yeah, someone of importance to Jamaica's culture and far more deserving, frankly, than myself. I already have an asteroid, right? ARCA! Yeah, they just rolled out this morning with their Eco Rocket Heavy, which appears to be a bunch of pipes strung together to look like a rocket. I think we're going to have another hot water deluge test. Maybe not a flight. It doesn't look like there's any stage separation capability at this point. But yeah, lots of nice videos, of course, promoting their capabilities. Anyway, back in the US, India signed on to the Artemis Accords. That's the agreement with the US is trying to promote to codify the use of resources from the moon. And yeah, at this point, there now have 27 nations that have signed on to this. But more importantly, I think, is that in a conversation meeting between Narendra Modi and Biden, they signed an agreement to perform a flight to the space station with Indian astronauts. Now, India is already working on its own crewed program, the Gaganyaan, I think is the name of the spacecraft. And it's not clear if their astronauts that are training for that mission, one of those will end up going to the International Space Station, or if they have somebody else in mind. Either way, we're going to get someone from India, actually an Indian citizen, flying to the space station probably next year, and most likely flying on a SpaceX Dragon. Now, the UK has already signed on to the Artemis Accords, but today they unveiled the Astra Carta, or at least unveiled the seal. So this is actually an initiative by King Charles III, who is, just come into his being as the King of England. This was a star-studded event with things like Tim Peake and Chris Hadfield and Brian May, astrophysicist and guitarist from Queen, meeting the king, which is interesting. Look, the Astra Carta initiative is basically space sustainability, i.e. please don't launch so many satellites that we have a Kessler syndrome, which I am fully behind. But yeah, it's just sort of another interesting angle. Obviously, Astra Carta is supposed to be a reference to the Magna Carta, which was a document which basically said that kings are not above the law. And for stuff to look forward to, well, I already mentioned that Ariane 5 should have its final flight on July 4th. We're also looking at China getting ready to launch Juche 2. This is their methane-fueled rocket. They previously tried, it never reached orbit. We thought Vulcan might become the first one to get to orbit. We thought Starship might. Well, now China's going to try again. It looks like it's getting out to the pad, so we could very well see it launched in the next couple of weeks. And planned for hours from now, Virgin Galactic is hoping to fly its first customer flight with 3 crew members from the Italian Air Force, doing all sorts of research. I don't know what kind of research they're doing, but I hope they get their money's worth, because it'll be nice to actually see Virgin Galactic finally flying commercial stuff after all these years. And of course, it's Asteroid Day on June 30th, so there'll be a whole bunch of events and activities surrounding, saving the Earth from killer asteroids. And so with that, I bid you farewell. I'm Scott Manley. Fly safe.